I used to believe that monsters only lived in the shadows. I thought they were the strangers lurking in dark, rain-slicked alleyways, or the villains we read about in storybooks to scare ourselves before bed. I didn't know that a monster could wear a tailored $5,000 Tom Ford suit. I didn't know a monster could smell of expensive vanilla perfume and cold ambition. And I certainly never thought a monster could share my exact DNA. I thought I knew my sister. That was the lie I desperately repeated to myself as I stood shivering in the doorway of the pediatric intensive care unit at Chicago Memorial Hospital. The room was suffocating. It smelled of heavy industrial bleach, rubbing alcohol, and a metallic, unmistakable scent of absolute tragedy. The only sound keeping the crushing silence at bay was the rhythmic, piercing hiss-click of a mechanical ventilator. It was breathing for my 9-year-old niece, Lily. Lily lay on the oversized hospital bed, completely swallowed by a tangle of translucent tubes and monitoring wires. Just yesterday, she had been a vibrant, laughing little girl, painting clumsy watercolors on my front porch and begging me for one more bedtime story. Now, her pale skin blended into the stark white hospital sheets, her tiny chest rising and falling only because a machine commanded it to. And standing at the foot of her bed, entirely untouched by the devastation in the room, was Eleanor, my older sister, the billionaire CEO of Apex Pharmaceuticals, a woman whose flawless, unsmiling face had just graced the cover of the Wall Street Journal. She wasn't looking at her daughter's bruised and battered face. She wasn't holding her tiny, freezing hand. Instead, her manicured fingers were flying across the screen of her smartphone, her icy blue eyes locked on a glowing financial spreadsheet. "Eleanor," I whispered, my voice breaking under the weight of sheer panic and exhaustion. "The neurosurgeon is waiting in the hallway. They need the deposit for the emergency cranial bypass. The swelling in Lily's brain is accelerating by the minute. They need $400,000 to begin the procedure, and the hospital administration won't move forward without financial clearance. You need to wire the money right now." Eleanor didn't even blink. She didn't look up from her screen. "Claire, you know I cannot liquidate those kinds of funds on a Tuesday afternoon." Her voice was as smooth, flat, and cold as polished marble. "My assets are heavily monitored by the board. The company accounts are legally locked in escrow for the Vanguard merger. If I pull $500,000 from my personal accounts today, the SEC flags it, the shareholders panic, and a $600 million deal collapses." The linoleum floor seemed to literally tilt beneath my feet. I stared at her, unable to process the horrific words leaving a mother's mouth. "The deal," I choked out, stepping closer, my hands trembling violently at my sides. "Eleanor, look at her. This is your daughter, your flesh and blood. She was in a horrific car crash. If they don't operate in the next 2 hours, she is going to die. You make that much money in a single week." Finally, Eleanor locked her phone. She slowly lifted her gaze to meet mine. Her eyes, the exact same shade of blue as our late father's, were utterly devoid of a soul. It was like looking into an empty, beautifully decorated house where no one actually lived. "I have spent 7 grueling years building this acquisition, Claire. It is the absolute pinnacle of my career. I am not letting my life's work fall apart because of an unfortunate accident." She casually slipped her phone into her leather Birkin bag and smoothed the lapel of her blazer. "The doctors will just have to do what they can with standard care. I'm boarding my private jet to New York in 20 minutes. "You're leaving?" I screamed, my voice cracking, no longer caring if the nurses at the station heard me. "She's in a coma. She could die tonight. And you're going to New York?" "Grow up, Claire," Eleanor snapped, her voice dropping to a terrifying, venomous whisper. "The world doesn't stop spinning because someone gets hurt. I'll be back on Friday. Keep my assistant updated." Without another glance at the dying child on the bed, without even leaning down to kiss her forehead, the billionaire CEO turned on her heels and walked out. The sharp clack, clack, clack of her designer stilettos echoed down the sterile hallway, fading away until all that remained was the sound of the machine keeping Lily alive. I collapsed into the cheap plastic chair beside the bed, sobbing until my ribs felt shattered. I was just a middle school history teacher. I didn't have offshore accounts or a massive stock portfolio. At that exact moment, I had about $4,000 in my checking account. But I had one thing: my house. It was a modest, three-bedroom home in the suburbs, the only thing our parents had left me when they passed away. It was my sanctuary, my entire life's safety net, and every memory of my childhood was tied up in its equity. I looked at Lily's innocent, battered face. The decision took less than a heartbeat. I pulled out my phone and dialed a predatory cash-for-homes real estate firm, the kind you see on highway billboards targeting desperate people facing foreclosure. "I need to sell my house," I told the broker on the line, my voice eerily steady as I wiped the tears from my jaw. "Right now, I have the deed clear of any liens. I don't care if you give me 40 cents on the dollar. Wire $400,000 to Memorial Hospital's surgical department in the next hour, and the house is yours." The broker scoffed, but greed won out. Within 30 minutes, I signed my life away through a digital portal on my glowing screen. I lost my home. I was officially destitute. But as the nurses rushed in to prep Lily for the life-saving surgery, I didn't feel a single ounce of regret. As a nurse gently lifted Lily's limp arm to insert a new 4-line, she paused. "Ma'am, we need to remove all metal jewelry before she goes into the MRI machine." Strapped tightly around Lily's small wrist was a thick, heavy silver charm bracelet. Eleanor had given it to her just 3 days ago. Lily had complained that it pinched her skin and was far too heavy for a child, but Eleanor had been terrifyingly insistent she never take it off, claiming it was a priceless family heirloom. "I'll take it off," I whispered, reaching over. I gently tried to unclasp the heavy metal, but as I held it in my palm, my fingernail brushed against the back of the largest charm, a solid silver locket shaped like a globe. There was a microscopic, almost invisible seam along the bottom. It wasn't a standard jewelry clasp. I pressed my nail into it. With a soft click, the locket slid open. Inside the hollow silver charm, there wasn't a family photograph. There was a custom-fitted, waterproof silicone seal. And wedged perfectly inside that seal was a micro SD card. Why would a billionaire CEO hide a digital data drive inside a locked bracelet on the wrist of her 9-year-old daughter right before a fatal car crash? I stared at the tiny black square of plastic in my palm, my blood running completely cold. I wish I had just thrown the bracelet in the trash, because what I was about to find on that encrypted drive didn't just explain the accident. It revealed a secret so dark, so sick, and so dangerous that it wouldn't just destroy my sister's company within 48 hours. It would make me the target of the most ruthless corporate assassins in the country. To truly understand how a mother could walk away from her dying child, you have to understand exactly who Eleanor was and the massive, undeniable chasm that had always existed between us. We grew up in a quiet, working-class suburb of Chicago. Our parents were kind, grounded people who believed in loyalty, hard work, and eating dinner together at the kitchen table every single night. I took after them. I found my joy in simple things: the smell of rain on the pavement, the quiet peace of a Sunday morning, and the profound fulfillment of teaching teenagers about American history. I never needed luxury to feel complete. But Eleanor was born with an entirely different kind of hunger, a predatory instinct, survival of the absolute fittest. Even as a teenager, she viewed human relationships as calculated business transactions. Friends were leverage. Boyfriends were stepping stones. She didn't just want to succeed. She wanted to dominate. By the time she was 29, she had ruthlessly climbed the corporate ladder at Apex Pharmaceuticals, crushing anyone who stood in her way. She eventually married the company's aging founder and CEO, Richard Vance. Richard was 30 years older than her, but Eleanor didn't care. It was a corporate merger masked in a white wedding dress. When Richard passed away under sudden, tragic circumstances 3 years ago, a massive stroke that no one saw coming, Eleanor didn't shed a single tear. She didn't just inherit his immense wealth. She inherited the board's absolute terror of her. She became the unquestioned queen of a pharmaceutical empire. And then there was Lily. Lily was a miracle baby, born late in Richard's life. A gentle, soft-spoken girl with wild curls and a laugh that could cure any bad day. She was everything her mother wasn't. She had empathy. But to Eleanor, Lily was merely a PR asset. A pretty face to parade at charity galas, dressed in scratchy designer clothes, to soften Eleanor's ruthless corporate image in the press. Behind closed doors, Eleanor treated Lily like a ghost. She was raised by a rotating door of exhausted, underpaid nannies. That is, until I stepped in. I practically raised Lily. I was the one who taught her how to ride a bicycle without training wheels. I was the one who held her during thunderstorms when she was terrified of the lightning. I packed her school lunches with little handwritten notes tucked inside her napkins. She called me Annie Claire, but in both of our hearts, the bond was much deeper. She was the child I could never have. Eleanor allowed this arrangement because it was highly convenient. Having her schoolteacher sister act as a free, utterly devoted mother figure meant Eleanor could spend 300 days a year traveling the globe, expanding her empire in London, Tokyo, and Dubai. I never asked my sister for a dime. All I wanted was my quiet house and my weekends with Lily. Looking back, the warning signs of Eleanor's true nature were always hiding in plain sight. The way she systematically ruined the careers of whistleblowers who questioned her ethics. The way she used predatory lawyers to sue small, struggling rural clinics that couldn't afford Apex's inflated drug prices. She had a heart of absolute zero. But I never believed she would intentionally harm her own flesh and blood. I thought there was a biological line even a sociopath wouldn't cross. I was tragically, fatally naive. As I sat in the hospital waiting room, staring at the micro SD card in my hand, a memory flashed in my mind. Just 2 days ago, Lily had been sitting on my porch, tracing the heavy bracelet on her wrist. Mommy was yelling yesterday. Lily had whispered to me, looking at the ground, her small feet kicking the porch steps. She was yelling a scary man in a suit. She said she had to get rid of the liability before the New York trip. Annie Claire, what's a liability? I had brushed it off as corporate stress. I had hugged her and told her not to worry. Now, sitting under the harsh fluorescent lights of the ICU waiting area, the memory made me physically nauseous. A liability. My hands trembled as I pulled my battered, 5-year-old laptop from my canvas tote bag. The screen illuminated my tear-stained face in the dark room. I took a deep, shaky breath, checking over my shoulder to ensure no nurses were watching, and slid the micro SD card into the slot. A password prompt immediately popped up on the screen, accompanied by a high-grade military encryption warning. Enter encryption key. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. Eleanor was obsessed with corporate security. I tried her birth date. Incorrect. I tried the date she took over the company. Incorrect. I tried the date her husband died. Incorrect. I paused, thinking about the sick, twisted logic of my sister. If she hid this drive on Lily's wrist, she would use a code that only she would associate with the girl. I closed my eyes, remembering the legal documents from Richard's funeral. I typed in the exact date Lily's massive trust fund was legally set to unlock. The screen blinked green. Access granted. My blood ran completely cold. I was about to cross a threshold I could never return from. The reality of what I had just done to my own life was beginning to set in. As the files on the flash drive began to slowly load, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was an automated email from the predatory real estate broker. Subject: escrow transfer complete, deed relinquished. With a single digital signature, I had wiped out my entire life's work. The house where I took my first steps, the kitchen where my mother taught me how to bake apple pie, the living room where my father used to play his old jazz records. It was all gone. By tomorrow morning, strangers in cheap suits would be walking through my front door, throwing my life into cardboard boxes. I was officially destitute. But as I looked through the glass window into the operating room, where a team of brilliant surgeons in blue scrubs were scrambling around Lily's fragile body, I felt a strange, overpowering sense of peace. Money was just paper. Lily was my soul. I sat down on the cold linoleum floor of the waiting room, hiding from the view of the nurse's station, and opened the files on the SD card. I expected to see offshore bank accounts. I expected to see evidence of corporate embezzlement, insider trading, or maybe the truth about her late husband's sudden, convenient stroke. But there were no financial spreadsheets. There was only a single, heavily encrypted folder titled Liability Protocol. I double-clicked on it. Inside were hundreds of PDF documents, private emails, and audio recordings. As I began reading, the complex legal jargon blurred together, but slowly, meticulously, a horrifying picture began to form. When Eleanor's husband, Richard, died, he didn't leave his majority shares of the company to Eleanor. He knew exactly what kind of ruthless woman she was. Instead, he left 60% of the voting power and $1 billion trust fund to Lily. The trust was legally structured so that Eleanor acted as the custodian, but she could not liquidate, sell, or merge Apex Pharmaceuticals until Lily turned 18. Unless Lily died. If Lily passed away before her 18th birthday, the trust and absolute, unquestioned control of the empire would legally revert to Eleanor. I opened an email chain between Eleanor and her lead corporate attorney, a man named David Sterling. It was dated 3 weeks ago. From David Sterling Legal to Eleanor CEO. Subject, urgent. New York merger blocked. Eleanor, the board of Vanguard in New York has discovered the hidden structure of Lily's trust. They will not proceed with the $600 million merger, knowing you do not have majority voting rights. The deal is dead in the water unless the trust is dissolved. You need a legal miracle. From Eleanor CEO to David Sterling Legal. Subject, urgent. New York merger blocked. The merger happens this Friday. I will not halt this acquisition. Do not worry about the trust. I am resolving the liability. Tell New York the deal is on. My heart stopped beating. The air completely left my lungs. Resolving the liability. She called her own daughter a liability. I scrambled to open the next document. It was a wire transfer receipt from a shadow bank in the Cayman Islands. $500,000 sent to an anonymous LLC just 5 days ago. The exact day before a black SUV was reported stolen in our neighborhood. And then I found the audio files. My hand shook so violently I could barely plug my cheap earphones into the laptop. I clicked play on the most recent file. It was a recorded phone call, automatically backed up from Eleanor's private line. Is it done? Eleanor's voice echoed in my ears. Cold, businesslike, completely devoid of a mother's love. The nanny is dead. A gruff, unfamiliar male voice replied, the sound of city traffic humming in the background. The kid took a massive hit from the bumper. She's at the ICU at Memorial. The doctors say she won't make it through the night. The brain trauma is too severe. Make sure, Eleanor ordered, not a single shred of grief in her tone. If she wakes up, I don't get the trust. I am placing the master ledger on her wrist tomorrow. If the federal authorities investigate my assets before the merger closes, I need the offshore drive out of my house and on her body. No one searches a dying kid's jewelry. Understood. Good luck in New York. The recording clicked off. A wave of physical nausea hit me so hard I had to put my head between my knees to keep from vomiting on the hospital floor. My own sister. My own flesh and blood. She hadn't just abandoned Lily to close a deal. She had hired a hitman to murder her. She orchestrated a brutal hit-and-run to kill her own daughter, just to unlock a trust fund so she could finalize a corporate merger. And because she was paranoid about a federal audit before the deal closed, she hid the incriminating offshore bank ledgers, the very evidence of the hitman payoff, inside a charm bracelet, forcing Lily to wear it, knowing the child would take the evidence straight to the grave. Suddenly, my phone rang. The loud ringtone pierced the silence of the empty waiting room, making me jump out of my skin. I looked at the caller ID. It was Eleanor. I stared at the screen, my chest heaving. I pressed accept, holding the phone to my ear, trying desperately to steady my breathing. Claire. Eleanor's voice came through, crisp, annoyed, and slightly panicked. My financial assistant just informed me that the hospital received a $400,000 wire transfer for the surgery. Where on earth did you get that kind of money? She didn't sound relieved that her daughter's surgery was paid for. She sounded terrified, because if Lily got the surgery, Lily might survive. And if Lily survived, the merger would fail. I sold the house. Eleanor, I whispered, my voice dangerously low. You did what? She hissed. Are you insane? You need to cancel the procedure right now. You are interfering in things you don't understand, Claire. This is far above your pay grade. I know about the trust fund, Eleanor, I said, a single tear rolling down my cheek. But it wasn't a tear of sadness. It was pure, unadulterated rage. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating silence that happens right before a bomb detonates. What did you just say? Eleanor's voice dropped an octave, losing all of its polished corporate gloss. It was pure venom. I have the bracelet, I whispered into the receiver. I found the drive. I know about the Cayman Island transfers. I heard the audio recordings. I know exactly what you did to her. I heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Listen to me very carefully, Claire, Eleanor said, her voice eerily calm, the voice of a predator who had just cornered its prey. You are playing a game you cannot possibly win. You have no money, no power, and no credibility. If you breathe a word of this to the police, you won't just lose your little house. You will disappear, and my men will walk right into that ICU and finish the job. You're going to burn for this. I choked out, my knuckles turning white as I gripped the phone. I am landing in Manhattan in an hour, Eleanor replied. I signed the merger at 8 a.m. on Friday. You have exactly 48 hours to destroy that drive and walk away. If you don't, you're both dead. The line went dead. The 48-hour countdown to the merger had officially begun, and the most powerful woman in the city had just declared war on a broke school teacher. That night, the hospital felt more like a prison than a place of healing. Every time the elevator doors dinged at the end of the hallway, my heart slammed against my ribs. Every time a male nurse I didn't recognize walked past the waiting room, I gripped the heavy metal fire extinguisher I had quietly unhooked from the wall and hidden under my chair. Eleanor wasn't making empty threats. She was a billionaire who could make a phone call and have a life completely erased. And right now, Lily and I were the only two things standing between her and a $600 million payday. At 4 a.m., the lead neurosurgeon finally emerged from the operating room. He looked absolutely exhausted, his blue surgical cap stained with sweat, dark circles under his eyes. I rushed toward him, my legs feeling like lead, preparing myself for the worst news of my life. The surgery was successful, he said, pulling off his mask and letting out a long breath. We relieved the pressure on her brain and repaired the primary hemorrhage. It was incredibly close, Claire. If we had waited another hour to get the funding. Well, it doesn't matter now. She's stabilized. Is she awake? I asked, tears of pure, blinding relief flooding my eyes. She is in a natural, medically induced sleep now to let the brain heal. He smiled gently, patting my shoulder. She's a fighter. She'll need months of physical therapy, but she's going to live. I collapsed against the corridor wall, sliding down to the floor and weeping into my hands. She was alive. My beautiful, sweet niece was alive. I had lost my home, my savings, and my entire future, but I had saved her. But my relief was violently short-lived. I stood up and walked to the hospital window, looking out into the dark, rainy parking lot below. Under the flickering orange glow of a street lamp, a black Cadillac Escalade with heavily tinted windows was idling near the emergency exit. It had been sitting there for 2 hours. Nobody got out. Nobody got in. They were watching me. Eleanor had already sent her fixers to lock down the hospital. I had to get the flash drive out of the building. If they stormed the room and found it on me, they would kill us both, stage it as a tragic murder-suicide by a grieving aunt who had lost her mind, and Eleanor would sign her papers in New York playing the role of the sympathetic, tragic mother. I needed a safe place to plan my next move, but I didn't have a house anymore. I had surrendered my keys to the real estate broker hours ago. I didn't have money for a hotel. My friends were all middle-class teachers who couldn't protect me against corporate mercenaries. Dragging them into this would only put targets on their backs. I walked back into Lily's room. She looked so peaceful, her small chest rising and falling rhythmically, no longer dependent on the machines. I leaned down and kissed her warm forehead. I'm going to fix this, sweetie, I whispered to her sleeping face, brushing a curl from her pale cheek. I'm going to make her pay for every single tear. I took the micro SD card, wrapped it carefully in a small piece of medical gauze, and taped it flat against my skin, hiding it inside my bra. It was the only place they couldn't immediately strip from me if I was ambushed in the hallway. I realized, staring at the monitors, that I couldn't fight Eleanor with physical force. I couldn't outrun her money, and I couldn't outgun her mercenaries. I had to use the only thing she actually cared about, her pristine public image and her company. I needed to strike her where it hurt most, the New York merger. But I couldn't just walk into a local police station. Eleanor was a major political donor to the city. She had half the precinct's commanders on Apex's charity payroll. If I handed the drive to a corrupt cop, the evidence would conveniently disappear into an evidence locker forever, and I would be arrested for theft, or worse, committed to a psychiatric ward. I needed someone completely outside of Eleanor's reach. Someone hungry. Someone who had nothing left to lose. I pulled out my phone and opened the web browser. I searched for the one person who had been trying to take Eleanor down for years. Marcus Vance. Marcus was an abrasive, brilliant investigative journalist for an independent financial watchdog publication. 2 years ago, he had written a scathing expose accusing Eleanor of falsifying FDA trials for a new cancer drug. Eleanor had unleashed her army of corporate lawyers on him. She sued him into oblivion, destroyed his reputation, bankrupted his publication, and forced him to write a humiliating public apology just to avoid jail time. If anyone hated my sister as much as I did right now, it was Marcus Vance. At 6 a.m., as the dull gray sun began to rise over the city, I left Lily's room under the strict watch of a veteran nurse I trusted, telling her to call a code blue if anyone but a doctor entered the room. I slipped out through the hospital's basement laundry loading dock, avoiding the black Cadillac in the front lot. I was exhausted, shivering in the morning cold, and officially homeless. I was terrified, but a dark, unstoppable fire had ignited in my chest. A mother had tried to kill her own child for a paycheck, and I was going to tear her billion-dollar empire down to the studs, even if it cost me my life. Chapter 5, Hidden Clues. Finding Marcus wasn't easy. When a billionaire decides to erase a human being from society, they don't just take their job, they take their ghost. I found his current address buried in a 3-year-old public court docket that I accessed from a cracked computer at an all-night diner. It was a decaying, red brick apartment complex on the industrial outskirts of the South Loop, sitting directly beneath the deafening, metallic roar of the elevated train tracks. The hallway smelled of stale cigarette smoke, damp carpet, and defeated dreams. I walked up to door 4B. My heart hammered against my ribs in a frantic, desperate rhythm. I raised my fist and knocked 3 times. For a long time, there was no answer. Just the heavy, suffocating silence of a man who didn't want to be found. "I know you're in there, Marcus," I said, my voice trembling but loud enough to pierce the thin wood. "My name is Claire. I'm Eleanor Vance's sister, and I have the exact thing you've been looking for since she destroyed your life." The deadbolt clicked. The door opened 2 inches, secured by a heavy brass chain. The man peering back at me looked nothing like the sharp, confident, investigative journalist I had seen in old television interviews. His eyes were bloodshot and sunken, his face covered in a week's worth of graying stubble. He looked at me with a mixture of intense suspicion and profound exhaustion. "Eleanor doesn't have a sister," he muttered, his voice gravelly and dry. "She has a shadow that occasionally carries her bags. Go away, lady. Her lawyers already took my house, my career, and my reputation. I have a permanent restraining order and zero desire to go to federal prison. She tried to kill her own daughter yesterday," I said, the words tumbling out of my mouth like shattered glass. "She hired a hitman to run down my 9-year-old niece in the street to unlock a billion-dollar trust fund for the Vanguard merger. I have the audio recordings. I have the offshore bank transfers. I have it all on a drive." Marcus froze. His tired eyes suddenly sharpened, darting down the empty hallway to see if any of Apex's corporate fixers had followed me. He unhooked the chain and pulled me inside, locking 3 separate deadbolts behind us. His apartment was a chaotic shrine of paranoia. Newspaper clippings, corporate tax filings, and printed emails were pinned to massive corkboards, connected by tangled webs of red string. Empty coffee cups and cheap whiskey bottles littered the desk. He hadn't stopped investigating my sister. He had just gone underground. I reached into my shirt, pulled out the small piece of medical gauze, and handed him the micro SD card. "She lands in New York in 3 hours," I said, my voice shaking as the adrenaline began to wear off, leaving me freezing cold. "She signs the merger at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. If she signs it, she absorbs Vanguard's security apparatus. She cashes out. She becomes completely untouchable. And my niece and I are dead." Marcus didn't say a word. He plugged the drive into a heavily modified, offline laptop. I gave him the passcode. For the next 2 hours, the only sound in the room was the frantic clicking of his mouse and the distant rumble of the subway trains. As he listened to the audio of Eleanor coldly ordering the hit on Lily, the color completely drained from his face. "My God," he whispered, pulling off his headphones, staring blankly at the screen. "She actually did it. I always knew she was a sociopath, but this is pure, unadulterated evil. Is it enough to take to the police?" I asked desperately. Marcus shook his head, rubbing his temples. "No, the audio is circumstantial in a court of law. Her billion-dollar lawyers will claim it's an AI deepfake created by a disgruntled, bankrupt sister. And the Cayman Island wire transfer is hidden behind an anonymous shell company called Obsidian Holdings. We have to prove that Eleanor physically controls that shell company. If we can't tie her physical signature to it, she walks." He turned back to the laptop and continued to dig deeper into the drive's architecture. "Wait," he muttered, his eyes narrowing as lines of green code reflected in his glasses. "There's a hidden partition on this drive. It's a shadow ledger. She didn't just hide the hitman payoff here. She backed up her entire blackmail vault." "What do you mean?" I asked, stepping closer to the screen. "Billionaires like Eleanor don't trust anyone," Marcus explained, his eyes scanning rows of encrypted data. "They keep dirt on their own lawyers, their own scientists, their own board members, just in case they ever need leverage. Look at this." He opened a scanned PDF. It was a confidential medical file, but it wasn't Lily's. It was Richard Vance's autopsy report, Eleanor's late husband. "Richard died of a massive stroke 3 years ago," I said, confused. "He was 72. What does this have to do with the Vanguard merger?" "Look at the toxicology screen." Marcus pointed to a highlighted line at the very bottom of the page. It was suppressed from the public medical record. "Trace amounts of a synthetic, untraceable aconitine derivative. It induces a fatal cardiac event that perfectly mimics a massive stroke." My blood turned to ice. "Aconitine, it's an experimental chemical compound," Marcus breathed out, leaning back in his chair, utterly horrified. Apex Pharmaceuticals was developing it as a localized anesthetic, but the FDA killed the clinical trials because it was too lethal. Eleanor didn't just inherit her husband's company, Claire. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with terror. She murdered him, and she used her own company's experimental drug to do it. Chapter 6, Investigation. The cramped apartment started to spin. My sister wasn't just a greedy corporate executive who made ruthless business deals. She was a calculating, cold-blooded killer operating in the highest echelons of corporate America. If she killed Richard, I stammered, trying to catch my breath, then the man she paid to run over Lily, he must be the same fixer who supplied the poison from the lab. If we find the scientist who synthesized it, we find a link to Obsidian Holdings. Marcus nodded frantically, pulling up a new database on his screen. I spent 2 years tracking Apex's off-the-books expenditures. There was a lead researcher, Dr. Elias Aris. He was the head of the neuropharmacology division until he abruptly resigned right after Richard died. Eleanor forced him to sign an ironclad NDA and exiled him with a massive severance package. If anyone has the physical, wet-ink documents linking Eleanor to the poison and the shell company, it's Dr. Aris. "Where is he?" I asked, my heart pounding. "He lives on a rural property in Indiana. About 2 hours from here," Marcus said, grabbing a worn leather jacket and throwing me a set of car keys. "We have exactly 20 hours until the merger signing in Manhattan." Let's go. Marcus drove his battered Honda Civic like a man possessed. We arrived at Dr. Eris's isolated farmhouse just as a heavy, torrential afternoon thunderstorm began to fall. The sky was the color of bruised iron. Marcus bypassed the rusted front gate, and we sprinted through the mud to the front porch. When Dr. Eris opened the door, he looked exactly like a man who had been waiting for the Grim Reaper for 3 years. He was pale, sweating, and his hands trembled uncontrollably. "Marcus," Dr. Eris slurred, trying to slam the heavy oak door shut. "I told you never to come here. I have absolutely nothing to say to you. She tried to kill her own daughter yesterday, Elias." I screamed over the roaring thunder, shoving my foot in the doorway to stop it from closing. "She put a 9-year-old girl in a coma to unlock Richard's trust fund. Look at me. I am her sister, and I am telling you, if you don't help us, a child is going to die." Dr. Eris froze. His eyes darted to my face, seeing the desperate, agonizing truth in my tears. His shoulders slumped in defeat, and he stepped back, letting us into his dark, dusty living room. "I told Richard," Dr. Eris whispered, pouring himself a shaking glass of whiskey. "I warned him not to marry her. She is a black widow. When he died, I knew exactly what she did. But she had the autopsy buried. She told me if I ever spoke a word of it, my son would have a tragic accident on his way to school. What was I supposed to do? We know about Obsidia Holdings," Marcus said, stepping forward, his voice firm. "We know it's the shell company she uses to pay her assassins. We have the digital wire transfers. But we need the physical documents. We need her signature. Do you have the original lab requests?" Dr. Eris stared at the floor for a long, agonizing moment. Then he walked over to a loose floorboard beneath the living room rug, pried it up, and pulled out a single, yellowing manila envelope. He handed it to me. "It's all in there," Dr. Eris whispered, his voice hollow. "The original lab requisitions for the neurotoxin, signed in ink by Eleanor, and the original incorporation charter for Obsidia Holdings, linking her directly to the Cayman Island accounts. It proves she is the sole proprietor of the dark money." I clutched the heavy envelope to my chest like a shield. We finally had the smoking gun. But as we turned to leave, the living room window suddenly shattered. The sound was like a bomb going off. A clay lamp exploded right next to Marcus's head. "Get down!" Marcus roared, tackling me to the hardwood floor. I screamed, covering my head as the sound of silenced bullets thwip-thwiping into the drywall filled the room. I looked toward the window, through the heavy rain. Stepping out of a massive black Cadillac Escalade were 2 men in dark suits. It was the exact same men who had been idling outside the hospital. Eleanor had tracked the IP address the moment Marcus connected the drive to his decryption software. "Out the back! Move!" Dr. Eris yelled, terrified out of his mind, pointing toward the kitchen. Adrenaline flooded my veins. I scrambled on my hands and knees through the glass and splintered wood, clutching the manila envelope. We burst through the back door into the freezing rain. We sprinted through the muddy backyard, slipping in the wet grass. The mercenaries were fast, their heavy boots splashing behind us. We reached Marcus's Civic. We dove inside, and Marcus slammed his foot on the gas. The tires spun wildly in the mud before catching traction, launching us down the rural highway just as the fixers rounded the corner of the house, raising their weapons. For 20 agonizing minutes, Marcus drove like a madman, taking blind corners and dirt roads, the rain completely blinding our view, until we finally lost the black SUV in a maze of suburban neighborhoods. We pulled into the dark, empty parking lot of an abandoned gas station. The rain was drumming violently against the roof of the car. We were panting, soaked to the bone, staring at each other in the dim light of the dashboard. They tracked us. Marcus breathed heavily, gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles were white. "She knows we have the files." I looked at the digital clock on the dashboard. It was 4 p.m. on Thursday. "Drive to the airport," I said, my voice shaking with a terrifying, absolute clarity. "We bypassed the Chicago police entirely. We take the evidence, the drive, and the wet ink signatures directly to the Vanguard boardroom. We crashed the signing." Marcus looked at me, a grim, dangerous smile crossing his bruised face. "Buckle up, Claire," he said, throwing the car into gear. "We're going to New York." Chapter 7. The Big Reveal. Friday morning. 7:45 a.m. Manhattan. The Vanguard Financial Corporate headquarters was a towering monolith of glass and steel piercing the gray New York skyline. It was a temple built for the gods of Wall Street, humming with billions of dollars of invisible power. Marcus and I stood across the street, hiding in the shadow of a coffee shop, watching the black town cars pull up to the front entrance. I hadn't slept in 48 hours. My clothes were wrinkled, my hair was a mess, and my eyes were burning. But as I watched Eleanor step out of a chauffeur-driven Mercedes, wearing a pristine, stark white designer suit, looking like an angel of corporate grace, I felt nothing but pure, predatory focus. "The executive boardroom is on the 50th floor," Marcus said, handing me a high-level visitor badge he had forged using his old press contacts. "I've already bypassed their internal network security from the coffee shop's Wi-Fi. The exact moment you're inside that room, you give me the signal. I will blast the drive's contents, the ledgers, the Hitman audio, and the murder documents, directly to the phones of every Vanguard board member, the SEC agents in the room, and the FBI simultaneously. If this fails, Marcus," I started, the weight of the moment crushing down on my chest. "It won't," he said firmly, placing a hand on my shoulder. "Go slay the dragon, Claire." At 7:55 a.m., I walked through the revolving glass doors alone. I bypassed the front desk with a fake badge, keeping my head down, and slipped into the executive elevator. The numbers ticked up, each floor a hammer, striking against an anvil in my chest. 48, 49, 50. The elevator doors chimed open. The 50th floor was a sprawling, silent expanse of polished marble and glass. At the end of the hall, the massive double oak doors of the executive boardroom were wide open. Inside, 20 men and women in expensive, tailored suits were sitting around a sprawling mahogany table. Photographers from major financial magazines were setting up their cameras in the corner. At the head of the table sat Harrison, the legendary CEO of Vanguard Medical, and sitting right next to him, holding a solid gold fountain pen, was Eleanor. She was smiling radiantly for the cameras, her pen hovering over a stack of contracts thicker than a phone book. She was seconds away from total victory. "Wait," I said, stepping into the doorway. My voice wasn't loud, but cut through the murmuring room like a gunshot. Every head turned toward the door. Eleanor looked up. For a fraction of a second, the flawless, icy mask she wore slipped. Her piercing blue eyes widened in genuine, unadulterated shock. She looked at my ruined clothes, my wild hair, and the thick manila envelope clutched in my hands. The blood drained entirely from her immaculate face. "Security," Eleanor barked, her voice instantly sharp and commanding, standing up from her leather chair. "This woman is trespassing. Get her out of here immediately." Two massive security guards started walking toward me. "I wouldn't sign that paper if I were you, Harrison," I said loudly, locking eyes with the CEO of Vanguard, stepping right up to the edge of the mahogany table. "Unless you want Vanguard to be indicted for a $600 million federal fraud." The CEO froze, frowning, holding up a hand to stop the guards. "Excuse me? Who are you?" "My name is Claire. I am Eleanor's sister," I announced, my voice echoing off the glass walls. "And that woman didn't just falsify her FDA trials to hide a massive corporate debt. She orchestrated a hit and run on her own 9-year-old daughter 2 days ago to unlock a trust fund, just so she could pass her toxic liabilities onto you." The room erupted into chaotic murmurs. The photographers started snapping pictures frantically, realizing they were capturing the scandal of the decade. "She is mentally unwell," Eleanor shouted, her composure finally cracking, her face flushing bright red with rage. "She is a broke, hysterical school teacher trying to extort me for money. Throw her out." I didn't argue. I didn't yell back. I simply looked at the hidden security camera in the corner of the room and gave Marcus the signal. 10 seconds later, the deafening sound of a dozen cell phones buzzing simultaneously filled the boardroom. The Vanguard CEO picked up his phone, opening the priority email that had just bypassed his corporate firewall. He clicked the audio file attachment. Suddenly, through the pristine speakers of the CEO's phone, the cold, dead voice of the hitman echoed into the dead silent room. The kid took a massive hit from the bumper. She's in the ICU. The doctors say she won't make it through the night. And then, Eleanor's own sociopathic voice replied, "Make sure. If she wakes up, I don't get the trust. No one searches a dying kid's jewelry." Chapter 8, Justice and Downfall. The silence that followed the audio recording was apocalyptic. It was the sound of a billion-dollar empire evaporating into thin air. The Vanguard CEO slowly lowered his phone. He looked at Eleanor, his face pale with absolute horror. He reached across the table, took the gold fountain pen out of her trembling hand, capped it, and forcefully slid the merger contracts off the table. "The deal is dead, Eleanor," Harrison whispered, stepping away from her as if she carried a lethal plague. "It's a fake," Eleanor shrieked, her voice cracking into a hysterical pitch. The pristine billionaire CEO was completely gone. In her place was a cornered, panicked animal. "It's an AI deepfake. She forged it. I have the assets. Harrison, please." "It's not a fake," I said, slamming the manila envelope onto the table. I pulled out the original lab requests and the Obsidian Holdings charter. "These are the wet ink signatures, proving you bought the poison that killed your husband, Richard. Proving you paid the men who put your daughter in a coma." Eleanor let out a primal, horrifying scream. She lunged across the mahogany table toward me, her manicured claws extended, trying to rip the papers from my hands. She never made it. The heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung open violently. A team of 6 tactical agents in dark windbreakers with the letters FBI printed on the back stormed into the room, followed closely by heavily armed federal marshals and SEC regulators. Marcus had sent the files to the Manhattan U.S. Attorney's office an hour ago. "Eleanor Vance," the lead agent shouted, drawing his weapon, pointing it directly at her chest. "You are under arrest for the murder of Richard Vance, the attempted murder of a minor, and massive corporate fraud. Put your hands behind your back." Eleanor didn't fight. She couldn't. As the cold steel clamped around her wrists with a heavy, final click, the flashbulbs of the cameras blinded her, immortalizing her absolute ruin. As the agents dragged her away, she looked over her shoulder at me. Her eyes were wide, panicked, filled with an impotent, hollow hatred. "You ruined me," she hissed, spitting the words. "You took everything." "No," I replied, my voice steady, finally free of the terror that had chained me for 48 hours. "You ruined yourself. I just made sure Lily didn't have to pay the price for it." I stood there in the boardroom, utterly exhausted, broke, and running on fumes. But as I watched my sister being led out of the glass tower in handcuffs, her empire crumbling to ashes beneath her designer shoes, I took the first deep breath I had taken in 2 days. The monster was finally in chains. We had won. Chapter 9, Emotional Ending. It has been exactly 6 months since the morning that shook Wall Street to its core. The media fallout was unprecedented. The Vanguard trap, as the journalists called it, dominated the global news cycle for months. Marcus Vance published his exclusive exposé, winning a Pulitzer Prize for exposing the deepest rot in the pharmaceutical industry, completely clearing his name and rebuilding his life. Apex Pharmaceuticals was dismantled by the federal government, its assets liquidated to pay back the victims of the fraudulent drug trials. As for Eleanor, the jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. The physical evidence was undeniable. She was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms in a maximum security federal prison, without the possibility of parole. She traded her $5,000 Chanel suits for a bright orange jumpsuit, her penthouse for a concrete cell, entirely forgotten by the world she tried to conquer. And me? I am sitting on the front porch of my house, the exact same house I thought I had lost forever. When the federal courts untangled the massive web of Eleanor's crimes, they completely dissolved her guardianship of Lily's trust fund. The judge, hearing the story of what I had sacrificed, officially granted me full, permanent custody of my niece. The trust fund paid back the predatory real estate brokers, invalidating the sale of my childhood home, with plenty left over to ensure Lily will never have to worry about a medical bill for the rest of her life. The screen door creaks open behind me. I turn my head, and my heart swells with a warmth I cannot adequately put into words. Lily walks out onto the porch. She has a slight limp, a permanent reminder of the crash, and a small, faded scar near her hairline. The physical therapy has been brutal, but she is a fighter. Her wild curls are bouncing in the wind, and her smile is as radiant and beautiful as the morning sun. She isn't wearing heavy, suffocating designer clothes anymore. She is wearing denim overalls, holding a sketchbook and a box of watercolors. "Andy Claire," she says softly, sitting down next to me on the wooden steps. I painted a picture of the garden. I put my arm around her tiny shoulders, pulling her close, resting my chin on the top of her head. I breathe in the sweet scent of her strawberry shampoo. "It's beautiful, sweetie. It's perfectly beautiful." I look down at her small wrist. The heavy, monstrous silver charm bracelet is gone forever. It is currently sitting in an FBI evidence locker in New York. Instead, tied loosely around her wrist, is a simple, brightly colored string bracelet. We made it together yesterday out of cheap embroidery thread. It doesn't cost $1 million. It doesn't hold dark corporate secrets, offshore bank accounts, or the sins of a sociopath. It's just a piece of string. But to us, it means absolutely everything. I used to believe that monsters only lived in the shadows. I learned the hard way that they can hide in plain sight, masquerading as family, driven by a greed so cold it defies human logic. But I also learned something else. I learned that no matter how much money, power, or influence a monster has, they can never outrun a person who is fighting out of pure, unselfish love. My sister sold her soul to build a billion-dollar empire on a foundation of blood. I sold everything I had to save a little girl. And in the end, the empire crumbled to dust, and the little girl is still here, painting the sunrise.